I can't believe I'm saying this, but people have begun to ask the question, what would happen if a fight broke out between Majulo Yuji and Gojo and Sukuna fighting together? Yeah, you're hearing me right. No, it's not a three-way battle between all of them trying to see who's the strongest. People are asking the question, if Gojo and Sukuna teamed up at their true peak of strength, would they be able to defeat Majulo Yuji? And as ridiculous as that hypothetical sounds, the internet is divided. Could the true strongest sorcerer of today defeat the strongest sorcerer of his childhood, working together with supposedly the strongest sorcerer of all time? Well, that's the question we're going to be trying to answer today, in a completely non-biased, fact-finding kind of way. See, I've been analyzing both Majulo and JJK panels for the last 2.5 hours, measuring blocks, counting buildings, using Google Earth to figure out exactly how wide cities like Shinjuku are, and so much more to try and figure out exactly how powerful Majulo Yuji is when compared to Sukuna and Gojo in their primes. And I believe I've found an answer. And thus, even though this debate is only about a week old, I feel as though I should be able to put it to bed. Because today we're talking Yuji versus Gojo and Sukuna. But before we get talking about Yuji beating down his cursed uncle and also his former mentor, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We are on to episode 60, which means the final fights of the Chunin exams are starting. Now, before we dive into this hypothetical 2v1, I want to flesh out who we're talking about here from the perspective of who's joining in on this fight. See, well, it seems relatively obvious what iteration of Gojo and Yuji we're talking about as it pertains to who's going to be fighting in this fight, as obviously we're talking about Majulo Yuji, the one who's been the #1 sorcerer in Japan for 70 years, and Shinjuku Gojo, that is to say Gojo after he's released from the prison realm and has to fight against Sukuna. However, there's a bit more nuance when trying to figure out what iteration of Sukuna is truly the strongest. That was actually something that we talked about at relative length when trying to figure out who would win in a fight between Sukuna and Meruem. However, the question gets even more complicated when trying to figure out what version of Sukuna to use for this video. See, because really how I see it, there's 3 versions of Sukuna that could very easily be considered him at the peak of his strength. There's Mechana, that is to say Sukuna when he was in Megami's body. True form Sukuna, that is to say the version of Sukuna that he turned into after being hit by Gojo's purple to heal himself one final time. And then, for the sake of today's video, we could also consider Sukuna while he was still alive. That is to say Sukuna before he turned himself into immortal cursed objects. The Sukuna of the Heian era, if you will. But Nick, why would we even consider that iteration of Sukuna? We know nothing about him. We know he was considered the greatest sorcerer of that time, and that time was considered the golden age of Jiu-Jitsu. We know that he was able to defeat the best fighters of both the Sugawara and Fujiwara clans simultaneously, and he held on to such ridiculous amounts of power that even 1,000 years later, his name still struck fear in the heart of every sorcerer who heard it. But unfortunately, we can't really scale based on legend. But the reason that we're talking about it today is because if Sukuna comes into battle as either Mechana or his true form, still using Megami as a vessel that he's got tucked away deep inside of himself, he comes into the fight with a distinct disadvantage. See, well, it's not entirely clear if Yuji's dismantle still only targets the boundary between the body and the soul, and by the looks of it, it doesn't, considering the fact that Yuji has very much used his dismantle over the course of Majulo to destroy cursed spirits like Mahito and the thousands that were pouring out of Tokyo. If Yuji is still even able to access this iteration of dismantle, a dismantle that allows for him to separate soul from body, which he most likely is able to based off what we're seeing in Majulo right now, with Yuji handing over Yuki and Chozo's notebook about the difference between the body and the soul and how to separate them, then the idea of Sukuna having to use a human vessel to exist in this fight is a huge Achilles heel. Especially when you consider the fact that the only reason that the Culling Games truly finished is because the combined forces of Yuji and Hana destroyed all of the cursed objects inside of either the reincarnated or awakened sorcerers. So when it comes to destroying cursed objects or separating cursed objects from a person that they're inside of, Yuji's basically a genius. So for the sake of today's video, we're gonna make Sukuna kind of hypothetical. We're gonna bring Sukuna from the Heian era. That is to say that we're gonna make him a person or whatever he was. It is not just gonna be a series of 20 immortal cursed objects inside of a 15-year-old boy, which also means that we're gonna give Sukuna his 2 mouths, his 4 arms, and for the sake of making him as powerful as possible, we'll also sprinkle in the 10 shadows there. I know, but Nick, if he's not controlling Megumi's body, how does he have the 10 shadows? I'm cherry picking. So with that out of the way, let's get to scaling the individual fighters heading into this fight, starting with who we were just talking about, Sukuna. Now, obviously, there's a lot to consider with this iteration of Sukuna. He has 4 arms, and therefore is able to use 1 or 2 hands for hand seals and the other 2 for combat. He has 2 mouths, and therefore he's always able to keep one of his mouths doing incantations to make sure that all of his cursed techniques come out at maximum power. He has Dismantle, a standard slashing attack that happens at a preset amount of power, and Cleave, a cutting technique that he's able to pour as much cursed energy as he wants into. That's usually proportionate to how much cursed energy he believes he'll need to kill somebody with it. He has his domain expansion, which allows for him to destroy everything within a 200-meter radius around him, so a 400-meter diameter, and within the confines of his domain expansion, all inanimate objects are attacked with Dismantle, while all animate objects are attacked with Cleave, destroying anything unlucky enough to fall within the confines of his malevolent shrine. And his true greatest technique might actually be his Fuga, or his fire arrow, a technique that he was able to combine with his domain expansion that allowed for him to turn all of the dust that he generates by opening Malevolent Shrine, as everything within the confines of Malevolent Shrine gets sliced into dust, into explosive cursed energy. And therefore the strongest technique that we ever saw from a substantially weakened and fatally wounded Sukuna was him igniting all of this explosive cursed energy into a chain thermobaric explosion that eviscerated a relatively large section of Shinjuku. Now, if you calc this feat, that is, say, if you look into the density of concrete, or concrete enforced with rebar, the kind of things that skyscrapers are made out of, and start diving into the physics of how hard it is to atomize, you can kind of come to the conclusion that the explosion that Sukuna triggers that ends up killing Chozo was somewhere between a 10 to 20 megaton explosion. And considering the fact that the Hiroshima bomb was a 0.015 megaton explosion, that should give you an idea of what we could be hypothetically talking about when talking about the destructive forces of Sukuna's thermobaric explosion domain expansion. However, that is not at all the ideology that I subscribe to. Yes, we can talk until the cows come home about the force necessary to atomize the massive buildings that Sukuna atomized, and therefore somehow come to the conclusion that within the confines of this 400-meter wide explosion, Sukuna launched the power of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. That to me is completely asinine, especially when we take into consideration in the JJK universe, even the strongest amongst the sorcerers in that universe have admitted that conventional weaponry would work against them, like when Kenjaku actively had to dodge and or block bullets shot at him from Mai using a regular old sniper rifle, and when describing what kind of conventional weaponry might be able to kill certain grades of cursed spirits. All we heard about special grade cursed spirits is that even carpet bombing may not work. There is a large disparity between carpet bombing and 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. So how do we scale what Sukuna was able to pull off with his final domain expansion? Well, it's pretty easy. He inflicted a diameter of 400 meters with complete and total destruction. A half a kilometer wide circle. That's very impressive. Take into account that he was also able to tank multiple purples from Gojo, including the one at the beginning of their battle that blew away one of Sukuna's arms, and the one at the end of Sukuna and Gojo's battle where Sukuna fired a red into his blue, blowing away a rather large section of Shinjuku, which pushed Sukuna basically to the brink of death. And as Sukuna was pushed basically to the brink of death by an attack that destroyed multiple city blocks, the most realistic scaling for Sukuna from an AP and durability standpoint is multi-city block to small town level. Sukuna can make a half a kilometer wide hole in the ground, and if somebody else hits him with an attack of somewhat equal power to that, he's able to survive. And as your standard city block is about 100 meters by 100 meters, this would mean that Sukuna's Fuga Amplified Domain Expansion, which was 400 meters wide, was about 4 blocks long. I guess long's not the right, it had the diameter of 4 city blocks, which means in total this thermobaric explosion probably destroyed somewhere between 10 and 11 city blocks. And tie all this into the fact that Sukuna was not only able to dodge lightning attacks from Kashimo and Kashimo's electromagnetic wave attacks, which should travel at either the speed of light or close to it, and most traditional calcs will place Sukuna's speed somewhere in the region of massively hypersonic to like low relativistic. Nobody until Dabura is using light-based attacks. So like high end, he's like 80% the speed of light, but he's mostly just like massively hypersonic. He's able to transform into his true form after being hit by the purple of Gojo before Cosmo can strike him with a lightning attack, which leads most people to believe that he's somewhere in the region of massively hypersonic. He's very fast. Thus, with all of that said, Sukuna's AP and durability is somewhere in the region of multi-city block plus to small town level with massively hypersonic speeds. And thus, with Sukuna out of the way, let's get to the strongest sorcerer of today, or at least the today of 70 years ago, Gojo. Basically, everything we need to say about Gojo's strength comes from his battle against Sukuna. The battle literally opens with Gojo from multiple kilometers away, firing a purple that blows away one of Sukuna's arms, even though Sukuna has time to react to it and amplifies his domain to try and negate some of the damage. Now, while Sukuna does immediately recover from the damage inflicted by this purple, this just proves that Gojo is able to injure somebody with a small town level durability, which makes sense when you consider the fact that Gojo basically evaporated everything between himself and Sukuna as he fired that purple, and the destruction of that attack cannot be understated. Assuming the purple that Gojo fired was 100 meters wide, which it wasn't, obviously. And we take the highball estimate of how far away Gojo was when he fired it, which is about 4 kilometers. This would imply that as Gojo fired that amplified purple, he destroyed roughly 40 blocks of the city on its way to Sukuna. Now, 40 blocks of destruction is very impressive. That's like Greenwich Village in New York, or like the Lower East Side. And while it seems crazy impressive, New York as a city, in its totality, is made up out of 120,000 blocks. And while New York is a very big city, that should give you a perception of the level of destruction we're talking about here. Now, obviously, this isn't the only time that Gojo is able to injure Sukuna over the course of their fight. Even non-exploded reds that Gojo fires at short distances at Sukuna are able to burn away at his face, even while Sukuna is amplifying his domain, which for those of you who don't remember, basically nullifies the curse techniques that you're coming into contact with. This is why people amplify their domain before trying to fight against Gojo, because by amplifying their domain, they're effectively able to punch through infinity, because the empty domain they're amplifying around their fists sucks in the infinity. However, the downside of amplifying your domain is that you can't use your own innate techniques while amplifying your domain, unless, of course, you're Sukuna. Oh, and before I forget here, it's important to note here that the purple fired off by Gojo at the beginning of their battle was Gojo firing a purple at 200% output, because Otahime was boosting his cursed energy using a Jujutsu ritual dance, Gakuganji was increasing her abilities, and Gojo's abilities with Jujutsu music. So not only was that purple that we saw from Gojo technically unreproducible, but also double as strong as he usually is. But still, both Sukuna and Maharaga were aware that if Maharaga busted out in the battle too early against Gojo, it would be obliterated with one attack. While Gojo is fighting against Maharaga and Sukuna simultaneously, he deduces the fact that Sukuna is running protection detail for Maharaga. That is the difference in strength between Gojo and Maharaga. And when Gojo does eventually end up eviscerating Maharaga, he does it with such ferocity, it destroys Maharaga's 8-handled wheel, something that 15-finger Sukuna, while using a Fuga against Maharaga, wasn't even able to do. And mind you, this wasn't a 200% output purple. This was just Gojo's final purple. A purple that not only, mind you, destroyed one of Sukuna's arms, one of his legs, and left scorch marks all over his body, but also destroyed what appeared to be a large section of Shinjuku. But how large? Well, if you look at the images of the explosion that we do get, you can count on the perimeter of the explosion that there's somewhere in the region of 13 to 14 crumpled but still standing buildings. And while we're not seeing the entirety of the explosive radius of this purple, in the top corner of the image that we're shown, we do see that the circumference of the explosion is beginning to curve, which means that we're probably looking at anywhere between a fifth to a sixth of the entire explosion area. Now, that obviously doesn't make it all that much easier to calculate, but if you look at Shinjuku, because mind you, this fight happens in a real place, you can get a pretty good feeling for how buildings are laid out and how big they are. And rather perfectly, if you pan on over to Shinjuku and you take the area between the Shinjuku station and the 305 freeway, not only does the math begin to work out rather well from the perspective of how many buildings would need to be around this circle, somewhere in the region of 50 to 70, you can count on the perimeter of this area between Shinjuku rail station and the 305 freeway, about 50 to 70 buildings. The area is also, rather conveniently, rather circular, and thus with relatively rough calcs, we're able to figure out that Gojo's final purple was probably somewhere in the region of a 600 meter wide, that is, say, its diameter, blast. But Nick, wait, that's a bigger explosion than we get from Sukuna's final domain expansion. Well, Yeah, that iteration of Sukuna was on like his 19th binding vow. His heart was not pumping and even black flashed like 13 times. Not to mention that we literally just covered that Sukuna's Fuga was not able to destroy Maharaga's 8 handles. Gojo's final purple should be stronger than Sukuna's final domain expansion. Doesn't mean that Gojo was stronger. Obviously he wasn't, but from a sheer offensive standpoint, I don't know, maybe he was. But the help that Sukuna got from the 10 shadows, that is Safe Maharaga and Agito, and the fact that Sukuna was probably better at RCT and had more cursed energy than Gojo is what ultimately led to his victory. However, on account of the fact that Gojo and Sukuna, regardless of what Gojo said after he died, seems to be very evenly matched, means that their stats should be basically identical. Multi-city block to small town level AP and durability, and high to massively hypersonic speeds. Now with all of that taken into consideration, does Majulo Yuji stand a chance? Well, let's think about it. Obviously Yuji, when he fought against Sukuna alongside the Kusakabe coalition after Gojo's death, stood no chance in a 1v1 against Sukuna. If it weren't for Hana's, Jacob Ladders, and Maki stabbing Sukuna in the heart, Yuta coming back as Gojo, and Domain clashing with Sukuna, and about a million other things, Yuji would have gotten absolutely dismantled by Sukuna. But with all that said, obviously over the course of Yuji and Sukuna's fight, he showed some ridiculous promise. Like when he strung together the longest continuous streak of black flashes ever landed in combat against Sukuna, when he mastered his dismantle that allowed for him to separate Sukuna's soul from Megumi's, and maybe most importantly when he opened a domain expansion that he really knew nothing about. And while in his initial battle against Sukuna, he had a very basic understanding of his blood manipulation ability and needed help from Chozo to use convergence, nowadays in the Majulo universe he's shown that he is the most talented blood manipulation user of all time, being able to fill an entire office building with his blood and effortlessly knock out not only a team of Sumerians, but also a team of human sorcerers with just enough finesse that they'd be put out for a couple of days, but not grievously injured. And mind you, he did this against all of them simultaneously while standing on the ground floor. He turned what was effectively a blood laser into blood heat-seeking missiles that can knock out multiple high-level opponents with ease. Not to mention he also literally cubed and amped Mahito fighting against Yuji in what was effectively a world made out of souls with his hands still in his pockets. I mean, he fought against Mahito on Mahito's ultimate home turf and didn't even need to take his hands out of his pockets. But by far and away, the most impressive thing that Majulo Yuji ever does is a low effort 2-target dismantle aimed at all of the cursed spirits flooding out of Tokyo, presumably spooked by Dabura's cursed energy. But how big were the explosions generated by Yuji's dismantles? Well, unfortunately, this is a contentious topic because there's those in the JJK fandom who don't want to believe that Yuji, over the course of 70 years of being Japan's strongest sorcerer, has gotten as strong as he's currently being displayed to be, and thus are saying that the explosions that we see from Yuji's dismantles aren't from the dismantles themselves, but rather just the steam being released from all of the cursed spirits being defeated in an instant. However, that's dumb, and even if that was the case, that would mean that Yuji defeated so many cursed spirits with just one dismantle that he was able to create 2 separate areas covered with a diameter of 5 kilometers of smoke, or steam, or whatever you want. Now, if you're listening rather keenly, you might have picked up on something I just said there. 5-kilometer diameter. Yeah, you know the pan out of Tokyo we get with 2 gigantic explosions after Yuji fires his dismantle? Yeah, that's just Tokyo. Like, just drawn in precise detail Tokyo. And therefore we can very easily measure the explosion that Yuji generates. The one on the left reaches just beyond Tama River to Meguro, and the one on the right basically blows away the entirety of all of Sumida. And thus, if we use the actual landmarks that are given to us in this manga panel to measure the diameter of these explosions, we get roughly 5 kilometers each, which means that the strongest attacks of both Sukuna and Gojo, when fired together, measure up to a mere fraction of what Yuji is putting out with a low-level dismantle. But what's the fraction, you ask? Great question. Let's do some math. The area of a circle with a diameter of 400 meters is 125,664 meters squared. The area of a circle with a diameter of 600 meters is 282,743 meters squared. Add those two up and you get somewhere in the region of 400,000 meters squared, which is about the size of a large park or a small airport. And that's working together, mind you, which bolsters our idea that both Sukuna and Gojo are multi-city block to small town level threats, even when working together. And we know this because they're always fighting in real life Tokyo. We can see the damage they implement. Please stop trying to figure out the melting point of concrete. We can just be like, oh, look, there's the KFC in Shinjuku. Looks like they destroyed about 4 blocks from there. Okay, cool. Good thing Gege lives in Tokyo and models literally every single fight off real life Tokyo locations. But anyways, I'm off track here. So the combined destructive force from like a diameter perspective of Sukuna and Gojo working together is somewhere in the region of 400,000 meters squared. However, the area of a circle with a diameter of 5,000 meters or 5 kilometers is 19,635,000 meters squared or 19.635 kilometers squared, which is a small city level attack. The entirety of Shinjuku City is 6-ish kilometers wide. So the entirety of Shinjuku City is pretty close to 20 kilometers squared. Now Sukuna and Gojo were destroying small sections of Shinjuku. Yuji could destroy the whole thing. Or Yuji could wipe out the entirety of a town like Millry, Alabama, which just so happens to have the exact area of 20 kilometers squared. I'm sorry, Millry, Alabama, unless I'm probably not sorry because I don't know what that town's like, but I got some guesses. But all that is to say is that a relatively casual dismantle from Yuji is 48 times stronger than the combined force of Gojo and Sukuna's most powerful attacks. But Nick, I can't accept that. What do you mean that Yuji's 50 times more powerful than the combined forces of Gojo and Sukuna? That doesn't make any sense. How could he be that much more powerful? I mean, it's not that crazy. Yuji is a death womb painting made specifically to be strong enough to be a perfect vessel for the strongest sorcerer of all time. The strongest sorcerer of all time, mind you, that he defeated at the age of 15. And yeah, he had friends helping him. And yeah, Sukuna was injured. But Yuji and his friends were able to accomplish something that the combined forces of the golden age of Jujutsu were not able to figure out. And then after defeating the strongest sorcerer in Japan's history, Yuji had 70 more years to train. And it's not like cursed energy just disappeared when Sukuna died. Do you know the amount of cursed energy that probably poured out of Japan after the Culling Games were brought to an end? Do you know how many people died and how many sections of Japan were destroyed? Sure, obviously, for like the first 40 years, Yuji had a bunch of help in the form of Todo and Yuta and Maki and Hana and like, I don't know, maybe Megami and definitely Nobara. That entire time, Yuji was undoubtedly the strongest sorcerer in Japan. And if we learned anything about JJK, the way the strongest sorcerer in Japan gets used is basically like a, I don't really want to do it today. Can we just send the guy who will fix it in 30 seconds flat? And thus for 70 years, Yuji had to fight against the strongest cursed spirits that Japan had to offer. And fight he did, apparently. I mean, the boy's got limitless cursed energy because he's half cursed spirit. He's had an entire lifetime plus to work on blood manipulation, and he stole his cursed technique from the strongest sorcerer of all time, whose cursed energy still probably resides in his body. At the end of the day, he just had fundamentally more time than either Sukuna or Gojo to get strong. Gojo dies at like 28. Yuji's like 100. He's like 85. But he's also not aging. His body is in prime shape and has been his entire life as a sorcerer. And while yeah, Sukuna's been around for 1,000 years, for like 960 of them, he was fingers. So who wins in this fight between the strongest sorcerer of all time, the strongest sorcerer of his day, and the strongest sorcerer of today? The strongest sorcerer of today in a relative landslide. It wouldn't be a fun watch. Both Gojo and Sukuna would take the titles of the great waffled ones. But who knows? Maybe my calcs are way off. Maybe I'm over glazing Yuji. Let me know who you think wins in this fight in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I was gonna work out, but then my friends just texted me and told me they're getting on Arc Raiders, and man, that sounds tempting. Oh, and shout out to I don't know how to say his name, Magnagamist, I don't know. Anyways, shout out to him. I saw him do this video. I haven't watched it yet, but I saw the prompt and I was like, oh, that's genius. So shout out to him. I'm gonna watch it, but go watch his as well. He makes a lot of great JJK content.